Okay, so what we're talking about here, up to this point we've been talking mainly about, well, we watched the Darwin video as an introduction. Darwin's dangerous idea, right? And now we've been talking about the history of the Earth and the age of rocks and stuff like that. And that's because that is the reason we've been spending so much time on dating rocks and the age of the Earth, is because that's one of the lines of evidence that Darwin used to justify his theory. So Darwin's evidence for evolution. Now, by the way, evolution just means change over time. And what Darwin called it was descent with modification. Now, think about this. You know what descent means? That's like your descendants, your children, your grandchildren, their great-grandchildren. So think about this, descent with modification. Every time you have a generation, there might be a slight change. And then over time, your descendants are actually something very, very different. Now, over time, what time am I talking about here? I'm talking about millions of years. This does not happen quickly. This happens. The only reason selective breeders can do it so fast is because they're literally trying to do it, right? And they're working it that way. If it's just happening randomly, it is going to take millions and millions of years. That's why it was so important to Darwin that he had what he called unimaginable tracts of time. You guys are working with 4.6 billion years on that assignment 31. 4.6 billion years. So, what were his evidences here? It turns out that in his book, in one of the packets I have, this is the last one you're going to do. Most of you probably won't get to this today. This has got excerpts from his books, The Origin of the Species. And in this, he lays out, I'm not going to read this for you because you can read it on your own later. He lays out what he thought were his strongest evidences for his theory. And here's what they are. 3 main lines of evidence. Now, this is partly my interpretation because it's not like he says, I have 3 main lines of evidence. But as I read it, these are his 3 lines of evidence for his theory. And you'll see why I say this when you look at the packet later. One is what we call homologous structures. Now, you should realize that this word homo means same or similar. Okay? So we're saying, and we've seen the word homologous before, in fact, with chromosomes, homologous chromosomes. Homologous chromosomes were one from mom, one from dad, but they're both the same chromosome. They both have the same genes on it, right? Now, a homologous structure is like this. And the second worksheet that you're going to do has these different bones on it. And you're going to see how the bones in the human fingers can be matched up one for one with the bones in a whale's flipper. So in other words, you could say this bone in the human finger can be matched with this bone in the whale's flipper. Now listen. Darwin thought this was evidence for his theory because he says it makes sense. If they had a common ancestor, then they inherited that basic bone structure. The guy Owen on the video, Owen, by the way, was no dummy. He was the curator of that museum and stuff. He said what it was evidence of is a common designer. If the same God designed all these things, why wouldn't he have used the same basic pattern? That's what Owen said. Now, I bring this up because these evidences are not proofs. And that's important. And Darwin would have said the same thing. No, it's not a proof. But to me, it suggests this. Okay? A few of them. To me, it suggests similarity. Number 2.
Looks good.
This one, I'm going to warn you, this one is the trickiest one. Geographic distribution. This is where his finches come in. And I'm going to sum it up for you, but there is a worksheet here where you're going to read and answer some questions about it. Here's South America, right? So South America is down here. It kind of looks like this. And then the Galapagos. Now, I'm going to show my ignorance here because I'm not entirely sure where the Galapagos are. They're somewhere over here. Okay? So, yeah, that's an area like the size of like the United States or something, but so the Galapagos are in there somewhere.
You should have just pulled down the map and then like circled the.
I should have pulled up a map on the internet, but anyway, here's the idea, and you're going to read this right out of his book. But here's what he said: the finches over here were more similar to the finches on the mainland than they were to the finches on these other islands. Now, so listen. Here's why that's important to him. He says, wait a minute here. The mainland environment, like the ecology over here and stuff, the climate, the types of rocks, the types of food available, is nothing like the Galapagos. I don't know if you remember from the video, but actually they didn't show it that much on the video, but the Galapagos are really weird places. They're really strange. They're nothing like the mainland of South America. However, they're very similar to these islands. So here's what he said. If God created these finches as they are in place, which is what Owen would have said, and Darwin's opponents, why did he make the same kind of bird here and here instead of here and here? Not only that, but it kind of looks like they randomly developed from this ancestor because they're similar to this in many ways, but then they all have unique kinds of beaks. To him, that indicated that you start here with one bird, it gets blown in a storm over to here, and then it starts to reproduce, and if they fall on different islands, maybe there was a whole flock of these birds over here, they all got blown to different islands, and then each one started to evolve independently. That made sense to Darwin. The last evidence, number 3, is the fossil record. Now, the important word here is record. Because basically what you see is as you go back in time, there's 2 aspects to this. As you go back in time, things get simpler. Creatures get simpler. Now here's another big point though that he brings up in the passages here I've reproduced. I took some paragraphs out of his book and put them on here that talk about this. The second one is this. Not only do they get simpler back in time, but there's these things called extinctions. Sometimes species disappear and never reappear. Sometimes huge classes, whole classes of species disappear. In the Cambrian explosion, there were all these weird sorts of creatures that don't exist anymore. So sometimes a lot of different species disappear and never. Did I spell disappear wrong? I think I did. And never reappear. There's one S, yeah. And never reappear. This gives the kind of flavor, it gives a suggestion that there's something changing over time. Okay? That it wasn't just one special creation event, that something changed over time. Now, the reason I keep mentioning creation and God and stuff like that is because Darwin did. And that was the controversy at the time. Let me just read you a quick blurb out of this. You guys will read the rest later. He says, "He who is not content to look like a savage at the phenomena of nature as disconnected cannot any longer believe that man is the work of a separate act of creation." What he's saying there is that man is part of this whole evolutionary thing. We came from apes. They were our progenitors, as you would say, long, long time ago, actually about 1 million or 2 million years ago. Some ape-like common ancestor. By the way, they didn't bring this out in the movie too much, but his first book was called Origin of the Species. It left man out. It left mankind out because it was too controversial. His second book was called The Descent of Man, and that's where this quote comes from. So in his second book, he got a little bit bolder, and he said, okay, let's talk about human evolution. Yeah. Oh, missing links. Yeah. So if you, one thing with the fossil record, and actually I've got a paragraph on this here. There's actually some problems with the fossil record. And those are basically missing links. Now he doesn't say this, but there are so-called missing links in the fossil record, and you read about this here. There are problems with the fossil record. Darwin, you could say all you want about Darwin, and some people don't like him, and because they think he did away with God or whatever. They talked about that in the movie. But here's the thing with Darwin. He was a true scientist, and he was very honest about his own theory. And if you look in the book, and you'll see even in this passage, he was blatantly honest about, he was like his own opponent in the book. He would literally lay out in detail the problems with his theory. He said about the fossil record, he says, if somebody rejects my theory because of the incompleteness of the fossil record, he said they would be justified in doing so. Now that's pretty bold to say, I just wrote a big, thick book about a theory, and you're justified in throwing it out because this one evidence is pretty bad.
What does it say,
Right?
sit on the wall?
But that's what he said. I don't know. Okay, so that's it. One other thing I want to bring out, one of the worksheets right here. Pay attention because this is going to confuse you on the worksheet. This is not in your book. That's why I'm bringing this up. This word analogous structures is not in your book. Now, homologous structure means like the bones are the same. Okay, you with me? Homologous structure, it implies descent. It implies, do you know what I mean by descent? It means common ancestry. Analogous structure is this, listen, same function, different descent. Here's what I mean. An example of analogous structure would be a bird wing and an insect wing. All right? They are analogous. Why are they analogous? Because they do the same thing. They make the thing fly, right? But that's where the similarity ends. There's no bones in the wing of a bird. I mean, insect. Insect. There's no bones in an insect wing. Totally different structures. But it does the same thing. Does not imply the same descent. They come from totally different common ancestors. Bird wings and insect wings evolved along two totally different branches of the tree. Totally different branches. The eyeball of a human and the eyeball of the squid, however, are homologous because they can be traced back to the same common initial eye spot or whatever it was. Yes? That's a good question. Actually, I'm not sure about the eyeball. I could be wrong about that being common descent. I'll have to look that up. But how do they trace it back? Well, what they would do is they can look in the fossil record, and they can see which things came first. And then they can look, and they'll see, like, there's a classic example of this horse, the horse evolution, which shows like these ancient creatures had like kind of like two toes, and they started to walk on two toes. And then later on in the fossil record, it becomes more like a hoof. So they can trace it by looking in the fossil record, and they see kind of a sequence of it going to simpler and simpler and simpler forms. The other way is with DNA, and we're going to talk about that later. All right.